All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Melanin Margin, the weekly chat show where conversations about race are never off the table. We're your hosts, Quaviondre Williams.
And Daquon Wilson.
So let's get into this week's conversation. What's hot on the table this week?
In an article on The Hollywood Reporter, we learned that Spotify is in the process of removing Neil Young's catalog of music from its service after the artist published and then took down an open letter with an ultimatum: deal with the vaccine misinformation coming from Joe Rogan's podcast or lose Young's music. Rogan, who hosts a Spotify exclusive podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience, has faced backlash for repeatedly sharing misinformation surrounding COVID vaccines on his podcast. In December, a group of 270 doctors and other medical professionals also wrote a letter calling on Spotify to, quote, mitigate the spread of misinformation on its platform, end quote. Shortly after, Rogan featured Dr. Robert Malone, a known vaccine skeptic who has promoted baseless theories about the COVID vaccines on his podcast. Spotify spokesperson told The Hollywood Reporter, quote, we want all the world's music and audio content to be available to Spotify users. With that comes great responsibility in balancing both safety for listeners and freedom for creators. We have detailed content policies in place, and we've removed over 20,000 podcast episodes related to COVID since the start of the pandemic. We regret Neil's decision to remove his music from Spotify, but hope to welcome him back soon, end quote. Until Wednesday, Spotify has remained silent on the issue of COVID misinformation coming from Rogan's podcast. So, Andre, I want to ask you, why do you think Spotify doesn't want to respond to that criticism or do anything about Joe Rogan's misinformation?
Honestly, I think it has a lot to do with that deal that Joe Rogan has made with Spotify because we learned that not too long ago, Joe Rogan made a deal of exclusivity with the platform that was worth about $100 million. And he brings in about 200 million monthly downloads for his podcast. So I think that it's a level of not just money, a monetary gain for Spotify, but I also think it's just the reality of we don't check rich white men in our
Mm,
society. We just don't. And the reality is, Joe Rogan is making them money. And as long as that's happening, there's not going to be anything to be said about it. I think that it's really funny how they said they've removed certain COVID-19 related podcasts, but it's funny that they said they removed it, but they didn't specify negative, like spreading misinformation. They didn't specify that. They just said they removed COVID related. So you're not even specifying what content you're removing
right.
specifically. You're just saying COVID related. So you're not even specifying the fact that if you say that you are not allowing misinformation of this pandemic on the air, then how is he still getting away with doing it without any kind of reprimand or repercussion? Because y'all don't want to go back on your investment.
Mm,
Got you. Because the reality is, we know that Spotify is climbing up in the podcasting world as one of the main podcast providers. And so, in order for them to do that, they had to bank a lot of these big name podcasters to have people flocking to their app. So Joe Rogan is known as one of the biggest podcasters, if not the biggest podcaster in the world.
right.
So it makes sense that having just signed that deal and having just signed that deal, having known who Joe Rogan is, because I didn't know who he was. I'm not even gonna lie to you. I didn't know who that person was until we did the research for this episode. So like I didn't know that he was as big as he was, but like I said, it is no surprise to me. I think the reason why they're not going to say anything is because they don't want to affect their bad. We know that Hollywood execs, they bleed green. They don't give a fuck
Right.
about who it's hurting. The fuck? Since when did Hollywood say they give a fuck about anybody's feelings? You know what I mean?
Listen, capitalism is a hell of a drug,
I
and
mean
they're
it
addicted. They
is.
are addicted. But I completely agree. Like, I also think that, during the pandemic, podcasting has become a huge thing. Everybody was like, oh,
Yes.
we're at home. Let's listen to some podcasts. Let's make some podcasts. And right now, we know that, Trashman with a podcast is trending.
Oh,
Like, that
yes.
is what is trending everywhere. You can always find somebody saying some trash things on a podcast. And Spotify is not going to give that up. It's so popular that they can't just give up one of their biggest shining stars. And I think, completely agreeing, it's all about that money. And it's also all about, if they have to take down one of their biggest creators, then they would be opening up the door for so much more,
Yeah.
because they're saying, oh, you know what, let's stop the misinformation right here. And then it's like, okay, well, if you have the responsibility for putting out misinformation on COVID vaccines, what about the misinformation so many people spread about sexual assault cases, or
Exactly.
the misinformation people spread about celebrities and people's lives, and all of these other things? And I think that they are worried about that domino effect of, okay, now more and more we have to really listen to what people are saying on our platforms and figure out, okay, we got to fact check this, we got to take down that,
Yeah.
and do all of this legwork that they don't really want to do.
And I think it's such an interesting conversation too, because they also bring up the idea of freedom of speech, right? And freedom of
Mhm.
disagreement. And so, like, while I don't agree with people who are on the opposing side of the COVID vaccine thing, or the getting the COVID vaccine or not, or whatever the case may be, or what COVID is, they're still entitled to have those thoughts. And it's such a weird place to be in, because, like, on the
Mhm.
one hand, you can't just take down things you don't agree with, right? But I
Right.
also do think that Joe Rogan is at a new level. I think
Mhm.
that people also to forget about the fact that freedom of speech also plus influence. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, just because you can say things, just because you can feel a certain way about it, when you start to say things as facts with people backing you up, and you have an influence over a massive amount of society, like the president. Let's go back to even the president. Yes, the president, of course, just like any other person, has freedom of speech, but there's still a level of influence that the president has based off of what he says. So when the president of the United States calls the coronavirus China virus, he's inviting Asian hate. He's inviting xenophobia and all that stuff. And I don't think that people understand that there is a certain level of responsibility that people who
Right.
have that kind of influence over massive amounts of people have to be checked. And so if we're talking about, mom and pop who have a podcast of 20 or 20, 30, 40 listeners, is one thing. But Joe Rogan has over 200 million people tuning in monthly.
Right.
It's an entirely different ballpark. It's an entirely different game altogether. And I think that people really need to take into consideration that while we do have freedom of speech, we also have we have to understand a factual speech too, and making sure that we're not spreading that the wrong information about things. Just like you can't like, there's certain things that you can't do. Like, there's I forgot how it goes, but it's like, freedom of speech is not freedom of consequence.
Right. I was just about to say that. Like, freedom of speech is not freedom from consequences. Like, our notion of freedom of speech is so different than what it actually is. Like, when we look at like what freedom of speech is founded on, like, it's literally people are able to talk out against the government without fear
Yeah,
of being killed or backlash or whatever like that.
yeah.
That is what freedom of speech is. Freedom of speech isn't like you can say whatever you want and do whatever you want and not have anything bad happen to you.
Yeah,
So when you have a platform or when you have social media, they all have these, policies that's saying, by being a content creator on our platform, you have to abide by our guidelines on what content we allow. So that's why, if somebody is spreading hate speech, their account can be taken down. It's not
exactly.
a, restriction on their freedom of speech, because that's not what freedom of speech is for. You
Exactly.
are specifically putting out hate speech, which is targeting certain groups. That is not allowed on our platform, and so we're taking you down. because you violated our guidelines. Just like with this, you are spreading misinformation about COVID policy, COVID vaccines, and everything. That is not allowed on our platform. We need to take you down. And that is what Spotify needs to do. Spotify needs to be able to take that firm stance or create something. Like even Facebook has something, even TikTok has
Mm-hmm.
something that's like at the bottom of anything that gets tagged with COVID, like this may or may not be true
Mm-hmm.
information. Check these
TikTok, yeah.
websites
Mm-hmm.
for, factual
Factual, yeah.
information. So if Spotify wants to keep the Joe Rogan experience on air, then they need to be able to have something online that says the views and opinions that expressed in this podcast are
Do
just
not
that,
reflect,
views
yeah.
and opinions. They do not reflect Spotify and what we believe. If you want updated information about COVID-19 and the vaccines, check these websites. But again,
Exactly.
they don't want to do that work.
No, I fully agree with you. I mean, literally, you lit it right on the head. Like, it really speaks to the idea of, like, while people can disagree and have different views on different things and issues or whatever the case may be, there is still a level of, responsibility that these
Mhm.
entertainment sites have to have. And I wanted to ask you, Daquon, do you think it's the job of these entertainment sites like Spotify to mitigate the content that is allowed on their platforms?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In our day and age, the internet runs everything.
Exactly.
Everybody is getting their information from the internet, basically. Newspaper sales are going down because people are going to online platforms to find out about what's going on in the world. And I think with that comes great responsibilities. Online platforms like Facebook, Twitter, social medias, and Spotify need to be able to mitigate what type of content is going on their platforms because it has such a huge effect because that's where people are going for news. Like
Exactly.
I know for me, I can easily, look at an article that I found, fact check it, see where the source is, determine, do all of that different things because like I have that training to just like do that as an academic. But that is not accessible for every single person. Yeah, you can be like, oh, well, like you can just Google it. But again, with different types of algorithms, based on what side of Google you are on, you might get different search results. And everybody doesn't have the same way to really merge through different types of information sectors. Like there's so much verbiage that just are highly elevated that like everyday people aren't going to be able to understand basic news that they want. And so when you have all different types of news, quote unquote, sources on your platform, you need to be able to say, this is really news and we stand by that because it's a reflection of the larger platform. If Spotify allows something to be on its site, then it reflects the views and opinions of Spotify because they're allowing it to be there.
Exactly. I fully agree. I think that there is even, just the fact of we need to stop putting these celebrities on pedestals of unreachable, like they can't be clocked. They can't be checked, when they do something wrong. And I think that all this is showing me, especially with Spotify's response, we're like, yeah, remove your music. We're gonna keep Joe Rogan up, we're gonna remove this music. It really does make it feel like they just don't care. You know what I
Right.
mean? Especially when they are still allowing the podcast to take place, or they're not gonna, at the very least, put a disclaimer beforehand to say, like you said just right now, this podcast does not reflect the views of the COVID-19 policies, or just something to tack on to the beginning of the podcast, because they can do that. They have done that.
Mhm.
You know what I'm saying? Before, when it comes to running ads, so you can obviously cut in any situation you want to. So specify that whenever COVID-19 is mentioned, that there is a disclaimer beforehand, a 5 to 20, 30-second, however long it takes to explain it, to say the views expressed in this podcast are opinions. They are not based in fact. If you or we don't know if they're based in fact or not, please reference X, Y, and Z CDC guidelines for the most up-to-date current scientific information about COVID-19 if you have any more questions or concerns. Because like I said, I do think that you should be allowed to express whatever opinion you want to. But the problem is, we also have to understand that you can say whatever the fuck you want. You can, absolutely. But again, you have to deal with the consequences of those actions. And for Joe Rogan in this particular case, there doesn't seem to be a consequence for him speaking things that could honestly kill people, that could lead people to getting infecting other people, or spreading misinformation is one of the most dangerous things in our society. You know, it's how so many stereotypes get started. It's how so many of this, it's the root of a lot of the problems in our society, is the spread of misinformation. And so I think that, you know, for Spotify not to take responsibility and or at the very least say that moving forward we will attack on something to Joe Rogan or something like that. I feel like even if they were going to still remove Neil Young's music, I think that saying, listen, if you still want to do that, that's fine. But our response to this is going to be to make sure that we double check to make sure that Joe Rogan is providing accurate information. But the fact that they're just kind of like, girl, it's not like a personal problem to me, that shows that our industry is more based in the amount of money that people can make for them versus actually creating quality educational stuff. So when people are talking about when people are talking about COVID or stuff like that, you know, and even I think even on talk shows, they have to say allegedly a lot. Like I think Wendy Williams and The Talk is like that. They have producers who come in and say, hey, you can't say this because we don't know this for a fact. So you have to make sure you say allegedly. They have like buttons, signs, or they'll talk in their ear or something like that to make sure that they are having the most up-to-date, accurate information about whatever they're talking about. And if they don't know something for absolute fact, they will make sure to state, this is speculation, this is allegedly, and
they're not trying to catch a case.
Exactly. And Joe Rogan is not doing that same thing. He is saying, no, this is what it is, and fuck what you heard. And that's a problem.